English humour. A saunter and a stroll down the avenues of English language humour. Part 3. Wit and Sarcasm. So I'll talk about satire and hangdog and nonsense in due time. We'll make a brief pause first, having established wordplay as one of the bases of English comedy. And we're going to look at ways in which it can be used in what you might call a highbrow way and a lowbrow way. We're going to look at wit in this episode and bawdy in the next one. So, wit is the subject of this segment. If you say English humour to somebody, they might jump to this idea of the monocled gentleman firing off a bon mot. Wit, according to the dictionary, is the ability to combine ideas with a verbal effect and humour. The Old English verb was witan, which meant knowledge. So wit is, it seems, the ability to make people laugh in an intelligent way. So we'll be looking at cases of witty replies. And the king of the witty reply in English was Irish. He was Oscar Wilde, a man who used a pun in the title of one of his most famous works, The Importance of Being Earnest, where earnest is a man's name and also an adjective meaning sincere or honest. A lot of the witticisms attributed to Oscar Wilde are not Wildean in origin. It seems to be that the wit of the day, whether it's Wilde or Ambrose Bierce or Woody Allen, gets all the witty phrases attributed to them, no matter who says them. George Carlin, the American comedian, says that he has a bit of a problem with this, mainly because the ones which appear on the internet attributed to him just aren't funny, or don't represent his point of view. If I've ever put on a show or a gig that didn't go as well as it could have done, I'm drawn to Oscar Wilde's comment when he was asked after the first night of one of his plays, "How did it go, Oscar?" And Oscar Wilde replied, "The play was a marvel. The audience, a disaster." After another of his first nights, Oscar was receiving an ovation from his public and the usual gifts of flowers when his arch enemy, the Marquis of Queensberry, came up to him and handed him a cabbage. "Every time I look at it," Oscar said, "I shall think of you," which is a marvellous way of bringing somebody down with the power of wit. Legend has it that in another confrontation, this time between Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer after an appearance on an American talk show, Mailer hit Mr. Vidal so that he fell to the floor, and as he was getting up, Gore Vidal said, "Once again, words failed Norman Mailer." Another of the oft-quoted society wits from bygone London was also Irish and also a playwright. George Bernard Shaw, author of some of my favourite witticisms, largely due to their exquisite brevity. "Mr. Shaw," a society lady once said to him, "I passed by your house yesterday." And Mr. Shaw replied, "Oh, thank you." Then there was the occasion when he was listening to an orchestra in a soirée. The orchestra leader, noticing Mr. Shaw was in the audience, had a note passed to him, which Mr. Shaw unfolded and read. The note said, "What would Mr. Shaw like us to play next?" So he wrote his reply and had it passed back to the orchestra with just the one word, "Dominoes." Among the famous witticisms, we also find Margot Asquith, wife of George Asquith, the British Prime Minister from 1908 to 1916, also a famous society wit, who was once introduced to the famous Hollywood actress Jean Harlow. Miss Harlow made the mistake of pronouncing her name Margot with the final T, to which Mrs. Asquith replied, "The T is silent, as in Harlow," an exchange which is so exquisite that I have to doubt its veracity. One from 60s London, however, is more verifiable. The comedian Peter Cook was in conversation at a party when one of the guests said, "I'm writing a book," and Peter Cook replied, "Neither am I." I think in these last examples we see the necessity for hangdog or deadpan, which we will be investigating later. These are not jokes that you say with a smile on your face. Now, controversial character, Winston Churchill. There are famous incidents of him at school questioning the Latin grammar, ridiculing English grammar rules. For example, the idea that you cannot end a sentence with a preposition was rife. He said, "This is the kind of English up with which I shall not put." The famous exchange at another party where he told a lady she was ugly, to which the woman objected, obviously, and said, "Sir Winston, you are very drunk." Churchill replied, "Yes, but tomorrow I will be sober." He so upset another lady at a party that she said, "If I was your wife, I would put poison in your coffee," which was a red carpet for Winston, as he replied, "And I, if I were your husband, would drink it." So wit is not the exclusive playground of the comic. No, we can have witty parliamentarians, as we've seen with Winston Churchill, and as was the case with grouchy Dennis Skinner. I think it was him who was told off for saying, "Half the people in front of me are liars," referring, of course, to the Conservative Party. Well, you're not allowed to use that language in the House of Commons. He was asked to retract. He said, "I'm so sorry. Half of the Conservative Party are not liars." And we can climb up the ladder of aristocracy to one of our monarchs, as even Elizabeth I was capable of a witty remark. In this case, the butt of the joke was poor old Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who had the misfortune to break wind while in Elizabeth's presence. Now then, this simply wasn't done, so he had to leave the court. He was humiliated. He came back 7 years later, and Elizabeth received him in front of her courtiers with the words, "Ah, Sir Edward, we have quite forgot the fart." One that reminds me of a Tallulah Bankhead classic, when a man came into the room she was in and said, "Tallulah, my dear, I haven't seen you for years." To which she replied, "I thought I told you to wait in the car." Of course, the impromptu of wit, as we've seen on these occasions, can be frozen into a script. We can have a witty play, you can have a witty satire. Here are a few examples. George Bernard Shaw, again, in his play Major Barbara, makes the observation that the morals of a nation are like its teeth. The more rotten they are, the more it hurts to touch them. Viv Stanshall's character, Henry Rawlinson, comes out with the line, "If I had all the money I'd spent on drink, I'd spend it on drink." Or examples from America. Comedian George Burns comments that it's a shame that everybody that knows how to sort out this country is busy driving taxis or cutting hair. And here's one from Woody Allen. "Sex between a man and a woman is a beautiful thing, as long as you're between the right man and the right woman." And let's go back to some non-professionals for a moment. George Gershwin, the composer, was on a chat show with Oscar Levant, another famous American composer, but not as famous, who he had to put down at one point with the comment, "Say, Oscar, why don't you play us a medley of your hit?" Walter Sickert, English painter, and for a while the suspected Jack the Ripper, was saying goodbye to an unwanted guest one evening with the marvellous phrase, "Come again when you can't stay so long." And Bill Shankly's making an appearance, Liverpool's legendary football manager, who said, "As I've not been to university, I've always had to use my brains." Or did he? Bill Shankly, as with legendary baseball coach Yogi Berra, also attracts the witticisms of their day, whether they are originally said by them or not. A Shanklyism that my father used to use was to dismiss a football team by saying, "If they were playing in my back garden, I wouldn't open the curtains." while Yogi Berra is famous for saying, whether he did or not, we've got to stop believing we're not as good as we think we are, and management is easy. You've just got to separate the 5 players that hate you from the 5 players that haven't made up their minds yet. So wit, as you can see, is something we can all join in with, and I'm sure we all know a witty person. I'd like to be giving the idea here that the English language form of wit is characterised by a kind of finesse, a kind of turn of phrase, and a kind of ellipsis where something is not said. A marvellous example of this is from a Times reporter who was sent to interview Welsh imbiber and poet Dylan Thomas, who died of alcohol poisoning when he was 39. So there goes the reporter, asks Mr. Thomas some questions and writes up the answers. The memorable one in this form. When I asked Mr. Thomas his opinion on Welsh nationalism, he replied with 3 words, 2 of which were Welsh nationalism. The era of the telegram gave rise to opportunities for wit, as for example when playwright Noel Coward received an angry telegram from one of the critics who he hadn't invited to the first night. The telegram read, "Please send a ticket for the second night, if you have one." So Mr. Coward sent back a telegram saying, "Please pick up 2 tickets for the show at the theatre. One for you and one for a friend, if you have one." Wit has been encapsulated in rhyme. Here are a few of my old favourites. The rain it raineth all the time, on the just and unjust fella, but on the just it raineth more, the unjust hath the just's umbrella. And here one, I think from Rochester, who will be cropping up later. Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none will call it treason. And a little anonymous one here. That money talks, I'll not deny. I've heard it speak, it said goodbye. Wit is a high form of humour. The lowest form of wit, as the famous saying has it, is sarcasm, a word which comes from the Greek word for dogs eating flesh. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether these are witty or sarcastic as we enter the world of the theatre critic. Nicholas de Jong in The Guardian wrote of an actress that she had a shot at the role of Desdemona and killed it. Across the pond, and many decades earlier, Mark Twain was writing similar pieces for American newspapers, including comments such as, "She ran the gamut of emotions from A to B. The principal actor had delusions of adequacy." Or of a comic opera, "I haven't laughed so much since the orphanage burned down." So this last statement's probably hyperbolic, or rather exaggerated. That's one way you can be witty. You can also use understatement. Again, we'll see lots of examples of this. But really, if you listen to particularly English people, you'll hear it all the time. So it wasn't the most interesting film I've ever seen, for example. I wouldn't precisely call him a genius. This kind of thing. To be technical, this is called litotes, where you boost up the meaning of something in order to deny its opposite. Put that together with the hangdog expression and the offhand comments such as "she's no oil painting" or "he's no spring chicken," we can see that sarcasm is at the reach of everybody, whereas wit we shall have to reserve for the genuinely quick-witted.